In this week's episode of Mushoku Tensei, we meet one of the greatest characters in the entire story, a man who has roamed the skies for the past 400 years in anticipation of the demon god's eventual return. The legendary, charismatic, magnanimous armored dragon king Perugius. And as one of the world's biggest Perugius fans, this was a character introduction that I was both incredibly excited and slightly nervous to see adapted. Perugius's introductory scene is very important, because at this point in the story, the most interesting thing about Perugius is his reputation. From Rudius's perspective, Perugius is practically a figure of legend. He exists in children's stories, he lives in a distant castle floating far up in the sky, and even serves as the namesake of the world's armored dragon calendar. In other words, he's a character we've heard a lot about and have certain expectations of, but in reality, we don't actually know anything about what he's really like at all. So when Rudius and friends are standing right in front of him, we finally get to form our first real impression of this legendary hero, and that impression turns out to be pretty interesting. On one hand, Perugius comes across as extremely intimidating, and the episode starts building that impression before we even meet him. Our first interaction with him is through his representative, Almanfi, a character who seems to possess a power unlike almost anything we've seen in this world. Seemingly limitless, completely controlled teleportation, allowing him to travel anywhere that he desires. And the only other time we've seen Almanfi was immediately before the teleportation incident, when he appeared in front of Rudius and instantly attempted to kill him without hesitation, requiring someone at the level of a Sword King in order to hold him back. And Almanfi is merely Perugius's emissary. Combine this with Silveril's questions about the man god as she escorts them through the castle, and the episode has deliberately promised us to expect a dangerous, intimidating confrontation with Perugius. And intimidating he certainly is. He lives in an extravagant floating palace, he sits atop a lavish, imposing throne, he's surrounded by a dozen extraordinarily powerful familiars, and he speaks with a serious, booming, authoritative tone. The initial impression we get of Perugius is that of a classic fantasy king. Important, powerful, seeing himself above the common folk, openly hostile to his enemies, and demanding of a respectful tone from all those that stand before him. He sees straight through the ever-composed Ariel and manages to make her sweat. He turns his 12 familiars to face Rudius as a warning to not dare use his magic inside his castle's walls. And he doesn't ask, but demands that Rudius and Sylphie bring their son to be named by him if he is ever born. Perugius is, altogether, an unequivocally intimidating presence. Yet within this introductory scene is an interesting complexity. When he initially treats Rudius quite harshly, Nanahoshi steps in and asks if he could be a little kinder. And surprisingly, Perugius doesn't protest or scoff or insist that he knows best, but simply listens to her and changes his attitude, going on to provide Rudius with what information he has about people suffering from conditions similar to Zenith's. When Zenobia asks him about the crest he found alongside the autonomous marionette, the two of them immediately connect over their mutual appreciation of art. And just more generally, Perugius is willing to hear the requests of everyone who traveled to meet him. He even allows them to leisurely stroll around the castle that he proudly describes as his pride and joy. So despite the overwhelming first impression, he isn't merely some intimidating warrior king. His introductory scene paints the beginning of a far more interesting character. Now, as with most things in Mushoku Tensei's story, the light novel does have some extra details that make this scene even better, where two particular moments stand out to me more than the rest. The first is Perugius's confrontation with Ariel. In the anime, Ariel introduces herself, and Perugius asks if she came to secure his aid. She quickly denies it, but Perugius immediately sees straight through her and tells her that she can't hide her motives from him. However, in the light novel, his response is considerably harsher. After Ariel introduces herself, Perugius replies, and I quote, "I already know who you are. You lost in that filthy, underhanded battle for the crown they're having in Azura, but you refuse to concede. Instead, you're dragging everyone around you into the muddy waters of conflict. Foolish girl." Not only is it a much more severe condemnation, but I also think it says quite a lot about Perugius himself. It shows the contempt he has for the political struggles happening in the world beneath him, while also establishing that despite physically distancing himself from that world, he remains remarkably well informed about the power struggles within the Azura Kingdom. Now, the second interesting difference in the light novel is Perugius' conversation with Rudius. In the anime, it's quite a straightforward exchange. He tells Rudius about the trouble he had teleporting him, and then provides him with the information concerning Zenith's condition. But in the light novel, there's two additional beats in between these moments. The first is a pretty funny exchange, where Rudius tells Perugius that he holds no grudge against him for what happened with Almanfi before the teleportation incident. But unfortunately for Rudius, Perugius had no idea what situation Rudius was even talking about, so it ended up just coming across as though Rudius had been silently holding a one-sided grudge against Perugius this whole time. But the more interesting difference is an exchange concerning Orsted. In the light novel, Perugius actually recognizes the name Rudius Greyrat as belonging to the man who managed to injure Orsted. He then warns Rudius that talented people like him have a tendency to become overconfident in their abilities, and makes it very clear that should Rudius ever decide to challenge Perugius himself, the only thing waiting for him would be death. I've always enjoyed the moments where characters acknowledge what is arguably the most impressive thing that Rudius has accomplished in the anime so far, so I was a little disappointed to see that particular exchange cut out. But overall, I'd say this was a good enough adaptation of the introductory scene of one of my favorite characters in the entire Mushoku Tensei story. Perugius feels every bit as important and intimidating as his reputation suggests, while also giving us just enough evidence that there's considerably more to him than it may seem like at first glance, and I'm very excited to see more of him going forward. But that's it, thanks for watching, subscribe right now, and see you next time.